The Loch Ness mystery got a new angle. Something is alive in the lake. Somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, there is a stretch of water so deep and so dark that we have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of its own floor. That is not an exaggeration to hook you in the first 10 seconds. It is a documented fact, one that almost nobody stops to think about when they hear the words Loch Ness. We picture a monster. We picture a grainy photograph. We picture a tourist trap with rubber toys in gift shop windows. But underneath that cartoon version of the story is something far stranger and far harder to dismiss than most people realize. For nearly a century, thousands of witnesses across different decades, different nationalities, and completely unconnected lives have described seeing the same thing in that water. And for just as long, the scientific establishment has told them they were wrong. Tonight, we are not going to repeat the postcard version of this story. We're going to go past the toy submarine that fooled the world for 60 years and into the sonar logs, the acoustic surveys, and the DNA results that most documentaries never mention because those documentaries are more interested in a monster than in the truth. By the end of this video, you may not believe in a monster either, but you will probably agree that something down there has never been explained. Let's start with the lake itself, because the geography alone tells you why this mystery has survived so long when so many others have been solved in a weekend. Loch Ness sits inside the Great Glen, a long fracture in the Earth's crust carved out by glaciers thousands of years ago, and it stretches for roughly 23 miles from one end to the other. In places, it plunges to depths of around 750 feet, which puts parts of it deeper than large sections of the North Sea. The total volume of fresh water inside this one loch is so large that if you combined every single lake in England and Wales, all of them together, you still would not match what Loch Ness holds on its own. Numbers like that are hard to picture, so think of it this way. This is not a pond you could walk around in an afternoon and rule out. It is closer to an inland sea, hidden inside a valley, and most of it has simply never been searched. Then there is the water itself. And this is the detail that changes everything once you understand it. The water in Loch Ness is stained almost black by peat that washes down from the surrounding hills, tiny particles of ancient bog suspended endlessly in the cold. Visibility can collapse to just a few feet below the surface. Divers who have worked in that loch describe it not as swimming into darkness gradually, the way you would in the ocean, but as swimming face first into a wall. One moment there is gray daylight above you, and the next there is nothing at all, a blackness your eyes never adjust to because there is no light down there to adjust to. You could pass within touching distance of something the size of a small car and never know it was there. Add to that a deep water temperature that hovers around 5 or 6 degrees Celsius all year round, cold enough to sap the strength from a diver's limbs in minutes, and cold enough to dramatically slow the metabolism of any large animal living down there, meaning it would need to surface far less often than skeptics like to assume. Every single condition that makes a body of water easy to investigate, Loch Ness simply does not have. And every condition that allows something to remain hidden, it has in abundance. Now here is a detail almost nobody brings up, and it is the piece that turns this from a sealed mystery into an open one. Loch Ness is not cut off from the rest of the world. The River Ness flows out of its northern end toward the sea, and since the early 19th century, the Caledonian Canal has linked the loch directly to open salt water through a working chain of locks built for ships. This is not a closed aquarium. Seals have been recorded well inside the loch, hundreds of miles from open ocean by river distance. Atlantic salmon swim through it every year on their way to spawn, moving from salt water into that black freshwater and back out again. Whatever lives, or has ever lived, in Loch Ness has never been strictly trapped there. There has always been a route in and a route out. The story most people know begins in the spring of 1933, when a couple driving along a newly widened road on the northern shore of the loch says they watched a massive dark shape roll and churn the water roughly 100 yards from the bank before it sank and the surface went still again. They ran a hotel on the loch. They were not strangers to what ordinary waves, boats, or animals looked like on that water, and what they described did not match any of them. A local newspaper picked up the story, and an editor reaching for a punchy phrase called it a monster. That single word, paired with the name of the loch, was printed together for the first time in history, and once those two words were joined, they never came apart again. What followed in the months after was not one strange sighting, but dozens, then hundreds. A motorcyclist said something crossed the road directly in front of him at night. Tourists pulled their cars over to watch something move in the water. Longtime locals who had quietly kept sightings to themselves for years, afraid of being laughed at, suddenly started speaking up because they realized they were not alone. And what stands out looking back at those early accounts is how consistent they were. Strangers who never met each other, standing on different parts of a 23-mile shoreline in different months and different light, kept describing the same basic shape, a long neck rising from the water like a periscope, sometimes topped with a small head, one or more dark humps breaking the surface in a line, and a wake far too large to have been made by any known animal. By 1934, this had become an international story, and that same year the image that would define Loch Ness for the next 60 years was published in a British newspaper. It showed a slender neck curving out of rippled water with a small head turned to one side, and it was attributed to a respected London physician who claimed he had photographed it by accident while driving past the loch. People started calling it the surgeon's photograph, and the title alone did most of the persuading. A surgeon, a man of medicine and reputation, had no obvious reason to lie. For 6 decades, that single image was the face of the entire mystery. It appeared on postcards, mugs, book covers, and documentaries. When people pictured Loch Ness, they pictured that photograph. And then in 1994, 60 years after it first appeared, the truth came out, and it was almost embarrassingly small. The creature in that famous photo was a toy submarine, barely a foot tall, fitted with a sculpted head and neck, built and floated on the loch as a deliberate hoax by a man who wanted revenge against a newspaper that had previously humiliated him. The doctor's respected name had been attached to the story specifically because it would make the lie harder to question. When that confession became public, the reaction was immediate and sweeping. If the most famous photograph in the history of the mystery was fake, then surely the entire legend was fake too. Case closed as far as most of the public was concerned. But here is where the story most people know actually ends too early, because the collapse of that one photograph in 1994 was treated as if it had also collapsed everything else, when in reality, the people who had spent decades seriously studying this loch had never trusted that photograph in the first place. Long before the hoax was ever confessed, careful observers had already noted that the ripples around the object in the picture were too small for something that size, and that the proportions of the so-called neck didn't match anything that actually swims. Serious researchers had quietly filed that photo under unreliable years before the truth came out. For them, the hoax confession wasn't a bombshell. It was simply confirmation of something they already suspected. The real case for something unexplained in Loch Ness had never rested on a grainy photo of a neck against gray water. It rested on something much harder to fake and far less photogenic: sound. A photograph can be staged. A toy can be floated on a calm morning and framed just right. But sound moving through water can be measured, timed, recorded, and compared, and it does not lie the way a camera lens can be tricked. Long before that fake photograph was ever exposed, instruments were already picking up things in the depths of Loch Ness that nobody has fully explained to this day. The first of these moments happened in the winter of 1954, and it happened almost by accident. A fishing vessel was working its way along the loch with an echo sounder running, a standard piece of equipment used to measure water depth and detect schools of fish. The crew wasn't looking for anything unusual. At a depth of roughly 480 feet, far below where any fish would normally be holding, the echo sounder recorded a single large, solid object, not the soft, scattered signal you'd expect from a school of fish, but one dense, unified return, the kind you get from something with real mass and shape. And it wasn't stationary. The crew watched as this object held its depth and tracked steadily beneath the boat for close to half a mile before the signal finally faded. These were men who had spent their working lives reading sonar returns, who could tell the difference between fish, driftwood, thermal layers, and the lake bottom just by glancing at a screen. And by their own account, what they saw that day matched none of it. That contact came 14 years before the photograph was even taken, and 40 years before it was exposed as a hoax. It never depended on the photo, and it never collapsed alongside it, because the two pieces of evidence had nothing to do with each other. The public simply bundled them together in their minds and threw them out at the same time, which is arguably the biggest misstep in the entire history of this mystery. People debunked the marketing and assumed they had debunked the science along with it. The 1954 contact turned out to be the first thread in a much longer pattern. In 1968, a university research group led by an engineer named D. Gordon Tucker brought a new type of sonar equipment to Loch Ness, not to search for a monster, but simply because the loch's depth and shape made it an excellent natural testing tank for acoustic instruments. Tucker had no personal stake in the legend whatsoever. He wanted clean data on how his gear performed in deep, cold, fresh water. What his instruments recorded instead were multiple large objects moving, rising, and diving through the water column in ways that neither the currents nor thermal layers of the loch could account for. When he analyzed the returns with the same cold, mathematical detachment he would apply to any engineering problem, he concluded that the targets were animate, alive, moving under their own power and roughly 20 feet in length. That conclusion cost Tucker something professionally. Engineers build careers on caution and on never overstating what their data actually shows. He had every incentive to find a mundane explanation and quietly move on. He didn't find one, and he wrote down what the instruments told him anyway. The pattern continued into the 1970s, when a patent attorney and physicist paired underwater sonar with cameras rigged to fire automatically whenever something large entered their detection range. Some of the resulting images appeared to show what looked like a large diamond-shaped flipper several feet across, and later frames seemed to suggest a body, a neck, and a head. These images were significant enough to be published in a respected scientific journal, and while the controversy around them was intense and never fully resolved, with skeptics pointing to floating debris and disturbed silt as more likely explanations, the journal's editors chose to publish them and never retracted that decision. By 1987, researchers organized the largest coordinated sonar search the loch had ever seen, deploying nearly 24 boats equipped with sonar in a coordinated sweep from one end of the loch to the other, designed to leave no gap in coverage. During that search, 3 separate large contacts were recorded moving at depths below 600 feet, well beyond where any known fish species in the loch should be found. The company that supplied the sonar equipment for the search stated publicly that the returns were larger than a shark but smaller than a whale, a strange and specific comparison from a company that had no commercial reason to hype the mystery. More recently, science has taken a different approach entirely. In 2019, researchers conducted an environmental DNA survey, essentially testing the water itself for genetic traces left behind by any organism living in it. The results found no evidence of a plesiosaur or any large, unidentified reptile. What they did find, in surprisingly large quantities, was eel DNA. The scientist who led that study cautiously floated the idea that unusually large eels might explain many sightings. The largest eels ever recorded exceed 5 feet in length, and because eels can theoretically continue growing throughout their lives if they never leave to spawn, a very old eel living undisturbed in the loch for decades could, in theory, reach a size well beyond anything typically seen. An eel of that size moving through the water could create humps, and a raised head could resemble the classic silhouette described by witnesses for generations. It's a compelling explanation, and it's grounded in real science rather than folklore, but it doesn't answer every piece of the puzzle either. It doesn't explain a solid sonar contact recorded at 600 feet, well below where eels are typically found. It doesn't match military-grade estimates from later surveys describing objects between 12 and 16 feet long, a size and shape that doesn't fit known eel anatomy. So what's left, once you set aside the toy submarine and the century of tabloid headlines, is a genuinely strange collection of independent, credible data points, a fishing crew's sonar trace from 1954, an engineer's reluctant conclusion in 1968, a peer-reviewed photographic study from the 1970s, a 24-boat sonar sweep in 1987, and a modern DNA survey that ruled out the classic monster while accidentally deepening the mystery instead of closing it. None of these depended on the fake photograph. None of them collapsed when that photograph was exposed in 1994. Researchers have continued monitoring the loch in the years since, including a widely discussed 2020 sonar recording of an elongated object at roughly 500 feet, described by those involved as one of the more compelling traces gathered in decades, and a large-scale surface search in 2023 that recorded an unexplained disturbance on the water that no one involved has been able to definitively account for. To be clear, none of this proves the existence of a prehistoric survivor or a mythical creature, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. The honest, scientifically grounded position is that Loch Ness almost certainly does not contain a surviving plesiosaur, that the cold, nutrient-poor water makes a breeding population of any large, unknown animal difficult to sustain without ever being conclusively filmed, and that unusually large eels or misidentified known animals likely explain a significant portion of historical sightings. But an honest position also has to acknowledge what the sonar data actually shows, and so far, nobody has produced a fully satisfying, evidence-backed explanation for every contact recorded in that loch over the past 70 years. What makes Loch Ness different from most cryptid stories isn't a photograph, and it was never really about a monster in the Hollywood sense. It's the fact that trained sonar operators with no interest in monsters, engineers testing unrelated equipment, and scientists running DNA surveys designed to disprove the legend have all, independently and without coordinating with each other, recorded something in that water that they could not immediately explain. That is a very different situation from a single blurry photo or an eyewitness account after a few drinks at a pub. It's instrument data, collected across decades by people with professional reputations to protect, consistently pointing toward the same basic conclusion. There is something large moving through the deepest, darkest, least explored parts of that loch, and nobody has definitively identified what it is. So where does that leave us? Loch Ness remains one of the most searched, most sonar-mapped, and simultaneously least understood bodies of water on the planet, not because people haven't tried to solve it, but because the loch itself is almost perfectly designed to resist being solved. It's too deep to fully map with older technology, too dark for cameras to be reliable beyond a few feet, too cold for divers to stay down long, and too connected to the open sea to be treated as a sealed, fully cataloged ecosystem. Maybe the answer really is an unusually large, unusually old eel. Maybe it's a combination of several known species being misidentified across generations of witnesses. Or maybe, as the sonar data from 1954, 1968, and 1987 suggests, there really is something down there in the deepest parts of that glacial valley that science simply hasn't identified yet. What we can say with confidence is that the case was never actually closed in 1994. That was only the moment the wrong piece of evidence fell apart. So, here's the question worth sitting with. Out of everything laid out here, the solid sonar contact recorded at 480 feet in 1954, the reluctant conclusion from an engineer who had every reason to want a boring explanation, the surprising abundance of eel DNA in the water, or the mysterious contacts recorded 600 feet down where nothing should be moving, which detail is the one you personally find hardest to explain away? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us why, because on a body of water this deep and this dark, the truth is still very much out there, waiting to be recorded by the next instrument someone lowers into it.